I discovered something interesting about myself while preparing for this week's sermon. I oftentimes get asked how ministers choose what scripture they're going to use in any given week. And those of you that have been a part of church for a while now have probably heard of something called the lectionary. Is everybody familiar with this term? Okay. If you're not, the lectionary is a 3-year repeating schedule of Bible readings, giving 4 different readings for each day of the year. An Old Testament reading, a psalm, a gospel reading, and a reading from the letters. Now, the origins of the lectionary are debated, but it's at least 1,500 years old, and it was intended to be a guide for monastic prayer life. Over time, Sunday readings began to guide the clergy in their preaching, ensuring that the congregation got teaching from all throughout the Bible. Now, I don't follow the lectionary slavishly. Sometimes the assigned scriptures for a particular week just don't speak to me. Other times I feel that the needs of the congregation or the community are elsewhere. But I do always check the lectionary each week. And so I've been preaching for just over 21 years now. So that is 7 trips through the 3-year lectionary. And another thing that I do each week is I check to see what I've preached about on a scripture in the past. Now I try not to recycle sermons. Sometimes, though, there's an illustration or a story that's just too good not to share. Sometimes it's interesting to see how my thought and my theology has developed since the last time I preached on a particular verse. But it was in looking back at my sermons this week that I made my discovery. It turns out that in 21 years of preaching, I have never preached the story of the widow's mite. This is one of the most famous stories from the Gospels, and somehow, subconsciously, I have avoided it time and time again. It wasn't conscious, I wasn't aware of it. It was a shock to me when I went searching back through my files this week and could not find anything about it. And so I had to stop and ask myself the question this week, why? Why have I shied away from this story? Is it because I dislike preaching about money? I think I've told you guys before that that's part of it. I know the suspicion that people have regarding churches and money, and I don't want to contribute to that. But I do think there's a little more to it than that. And I want to explore this scene this morning. Our story takes place in what is called the Court of the Women in the temple in Jerusalem. This was the outer court. The temple was divided into various areas. The closer you got to the center, the closer you were to God. And so there was the court of the Gentiles, there was the court of the women, there was the court of the men, there was the Holy of Holies, all dividing people and deciding who could get closer to God. And in this court of the women were 13 trumpet-shaped collection receptacles for receiving worshipers' free will offerings and contributions. And it is from a vantage point opposite one of those receptacles that Jesus was observing the Passover crowd that day and how they were putting their money into the temple treasury. In contrast with the many wealthy people who gave large amounts, one unnamed poor widow gave 2 lepta, the Greek calls it, the smallest bronze coin in circulation in Palestine. 2 of these coins were worth approximately 1/64 of a Roman denarius. And the denarius was a day's wage for the average person. So to put this in our context for the day, I did a little bit of research this week. The average salary in the UK right now is £26,266 a year, or around £13 an hour, £104 a day. And so at 1/64th of that, her two mites, her two lepta, were the modern day equivalent of about £1.60. The real point of this, though, is Jesus makes clear that this was all that she had to live on. I think it's especially interesting whenever we read those words in light of this painting that I discovered online this week. This is by the French artist James Tissot, and he has a bit of a different take on this story. I don't know about you, but whenever I've read this story and we read about the widow, I'm always picturing an older woman going forward. But Tissot has envisioned this widow as a young lady carrying a baby or a young child. When we think of it in this light, of all that she had to live on, all for her family, the sacrifice that she made really hits home for us. Jesus as well notices this gift and he draws attention to it. Truly I say to you, he begins. A solemn introduction that Jesus uses time and again to tell his disciples that this is something that we should be paying attention to. That he is about to say something important. She has given more than all the others, for they contributed out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, gave everything. Traditionally, this story has been used to encourage giving, to praise the faith of the widow, to note her sacrificial act, an act that unbeknownst to her would be proclaimed and retold throughout the centuries. But there's always been something about this story that has bothered me a little bit. Now, obviously as clergy, I know how important giving is to the life of the church. I literally depend upon your giving to feed my family. But the kind of giving all that is being described here in these verses has always made me uncomfortable. And for a long time, honestly, I thought it was out of shame. I've told you all before, my grandfather was a United Methodist minister back in the United States. And in my grandfather's day, clergy were paid a pittance. As a matter of fact, my grandfather depended not only upon his salary, but on gifts of food from the congregation to be able to feed his family. Without the occasional farmer dropping off a side of pork or extra produce, there are times when my grandfather probably would not have been able to feed his children. And so I thought that perhaps maybe I have a bit of a kind of survivor's guilt. Not that clergy today make huge salaries, either here or in the States, but we do okay. Certainly much better than my grandfather did. Maybe this story made me uncomfortable because I can't see myself making this kind of total sacrifice that we read the widow doing here. So this week, I decided that I really needed to dig into this scripture. And in doing so, I discovered an interpretation that I believe sheds some light on my unconscious discomfort with this story. I believe it was about 30 years ago that scholars began to re-examine this scripture. And in doing so, they did something that every first-year Bible student is encouraged to do, yet I had managed to overlook for 20 years. And that is to look at the story within its context. The disadvantage of the lectionary, the disadvantage even of the chapter divisions that we have of the Bible today is that we look at these as separate stories, individual teachings that are disconnected from one another. But we need to remember that Jesus had a bigger mission than just dispensing unrelated wisdom, like he was some human fortune cookie. As a matter of fact, Jesus had many overall themes that he was focused on in the life of his ministry. And the biblical authors, those that actually wrote down Jesus' words, they were smart people as well. They picked up on these themes and they recorded Jesus' words in a way that was meant to build upon each other, denying us the easy route of just taking these one story at a time. If we look at this story in context of what comes immediately before and immediately after, we get a bit of a different take on the widow's mite. In the paragraphs directly before, as were read this morning, Jesus is condemning the religious leaders, the rich and elite of his own day. He says, "Beware of the scribes who like walking around in long robes and respectful greetings in the marketplace, and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." When we go straight from this paragraph into the next with this verbal link of the widow being a part of them, we get an entirely different story. While Jesus is naturally not attacking the faith of the widow, we do see here that he is angry at the elite, the religious leaders, the rich of his day, who are persuading the widows to give all of their money to the temple bank account. And that temple bank account, unfortunately, was not being used to honor God. Jesus says instead that they were strutting around in their fancy robes. They were making a great show of their religion. We then go farther and we read the verses directly following the widow's mite, where the disciples are marveling at how beautiful the buildings of the temple are. And Jesus says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Jesus isn't impressed by these wonderful stones and these wonderful buildings, because the poor are going bankrupt to finance them. And so if we look at this story in the context of the verses that precede and proceed it, we see that the story of the widow's mite isn't about encouraging giving everything that you have to live on, but it's about condemning a system that is taking advantage of those that have that kind of heart to give. Jesus is standing in the line of the prophets Amos, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, who pointed out the people of the land have practiced oppression and committed robbery. They have wronged the poor and needy and attacked the sojourner without justice. Now again, this is not an attack on the faith or the actions of the widow. What she did with a pure heart, and that is to be remembered. But Jesus is calling us to notice that she was a victim of oppression. So many times, Jesus ends his parables or his instructions with words such as "go and do likewise," or "go and practice this yourself." And somehow we have inserted those words into the end of the story of the widow's mite. But they're not there. Instead, he was concerned with the poor. He was concerned with the most vulnerable in his society. And he promised to do what the religious leaders of the day said only the temple could do. He offered forgiveness of sins. But he offered it without having to pay for temple sacrifices, without having to give everything that you had to get that forgiveness. In the Gospel of John, he goes farther and he tells them that this temple in Jerusalem will be replaced with a new temple. A temple in his body where these kind of sacrifices and payments are no longer necessary. Now, as I said at the beginning of the sermon, I don't like preaching about money and giving. I think that church giving is important, of course. I believe tithing is important, and I will have to preach on that from time to time, I'm sure. But I don't want anyone to give until it hurts. I don't want anyone to give to the church or to a charity rather than feeding their family. But more than that, I don't want anyone to have to be in a situation where they're forced to make that choice. And that is what Jesus was calling his disciples' attention to 2,000 years ago. Jesus was aiming for a system where we can give, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of love. A system that we should still be aiming for today.